This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. Dr. Gautam Sen joins me today from London. Dr. Sen is one of the people who, in the last few years, would constantly talk to me about what is the major environment related security crisis that we may face via Bangladesh. And I was reminded of all our conversations this week, particularly as many vested interests in Bangladesh began to very loudly complain that India had, in a sense, released water from one of the major dams in the northeast, which was causing major flooding in parts of Bangladesh. This, of course, also led to a very strange sort of quote unquote student protest. And even the Indian High Commissioner in Bangladesh was called in for a conversation about this. All of this led me to invite Gautam Sen to have this conversation with me to try and understand what are some of the major crises that we might face related to Bangladesh, which are also connected to our security and environmental challenges. Gautam Sen, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me to your program, Hindol.
Dr. Sen, let me begin by asking you then. You and I have often spoken about this, and you have been talking to me about this for several years now, that one of the biggest security related crises that we face as far as Bangladesh is concerned is rising sea levels and problems of flooding that happens quite regularly in that country and is set to get much worse. Now, this is the country with nearly 200 million people. If major flooding happens and parts of the country become, in a sense, inaccessible for long periods of time, that would cause serious crisis on our borders. Explain how.
I think there are two types of issues that are almost certainly going to crop up. The first is the one that actually is happening right now and has been occurring for many decades, which is a steady inflow of Bangladeshis into India due to economic distress and the problems of flooding. Now, this will rise and fall depending on the circumstances, but the numbers involved may still be too substantial for India to cope with. And I believe even the great fan of all regimes in Bangladesh, MP Shashi Tharoor, says there are 30 million Bangladeshis in India already, and others are saying the numbers are closer to 40 million plus. Then there is a different and much more catastrophic problem which may arise if there are severe floods in a very short period of time, and then tens of millions try to seek refuge in India because they will have nowhere to go. Assam, Tripura, and West Bengal and beyond are liable to be completely overwhelmed by the numbers who wish to come. Now, this actually is virtually guaranteed to occur, and I don't see how this movement of population can be stopped. And we're talking about tens of millions of people. In effect, India will cease to exist as we know it today.
Why do you say that? Some may think that this is, surely this could be contained. Surely tens of millions of people rushing to our borders could be something that could be contained. And some might feel that this is a bit dramatic. But, and I want to caveat that by saying already when, we saw when after Sheikh Hasina left Bangladesh, the crisis built up on its streets. Already on our borders, there were hundreds of people who were gathering. And we saw all these videos of our border security force speaking to them in the Bengali language, trying to convince them to stay away from the borders. Of course, if large volumes begin to come, it would be difficult.
Well, we already have experience of this. Very large numbers moved to India in 1947, 1950, 1964, and 10 million plus came to India in 1971 in a very short span of time. Now, these were mainly Hindus fleeing atrocities. There's nothing to say that this number could not rise to 20 or 30 million if there is a very severe crisis of flooding in Bangladesh, which is threatening the lives of large numbers of people. So if 10 million come in a few months and others did not come because they were not affected by the atrocities, this could certainly be 20 and 30, maybe more. I don't see there is any way of stopping this. The only solution in the medium term is to build sea defenses on a very large scale. And I've often thought a major center ought to be set up in Dhaka, paid for by India, and with Dutch experts who have a great deal of experience in this area to think long term about how sea defenses can be built, not to cure the problem altogether, but to prevent the worst happening. But I'm afraid governments in our region lack imagination, and certainly they don't think long term most of the time.
Let me talk to you also about the question of, even before this catastrophic thing that you explain happens, there is likely to be incessant issues about flooding. Climate change is impacting the entire Indian subcontinent. The East will see more and more cases of flooding. What happened this time in Tripura, which led to the flooding of the Gomti River, the Gumti River, not the Gomti River, I'm sorry, the Gomti River, the flooding of the Gomti River, this kind of stuff will happen again. In Tripura, of course, there's been tremendous flooding, and in other parts of the northeast, and that will naturally spill over to Bangladesh, whereas vested interests in Bangladesh immediately will say that this is India doing this to us.
Actually, let me take a radical view on this matter. The dams being opened in Tripura are the product of an Indo-Bangladeshi agreement that the event of a flood, warnings will be issued and flood waters will be released, because if the dam is overwhelmed, it will devastate both India and Bangladesh. So the dam breaking is much worse. So water will have to be released because there is no option. And this has been happening across China in the past year with huge loss of property and lives. So this is not unusual. And 3 barrages were opened in succession with warnings issued that the flood waters were unstoppable, and both parties had an agreement that this is what would happen because they understood the alternative was potentially infinitely worse. So why did this problem happen? This was orchestrated from Washington. This is a propaganda campaign. Washington wants to create estrangement between ordinary Bangladeshis and Indians in such a way that the regime change coup which it sponsored is irreversible. There is a fear that substantial segments of the Bangladeshi population remains loyal to the Awami League and even to Sheikh Hasina. And they want to make absolutely sure that there is such a public anger against India that Sheikh Hasina, who could only come back to power with some degree of sponsorship from India, will never be able to come back, because the US has a long-term plan to stay in Bangladesh. Basically, they wanted Bangladesh. It was low-hanging fruit, and they took it. And the reasons for this are very clear and of great geopolitical significance for the Indo-Pacific. The ports in Bangladesh are potentially very substantial and could host navies. Bangladesh actually has a flourishing shipping industry, and these could be enlarged to provide services of repair and rest for American naval vessels. And bear in mind, this overlooks the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. On that region, it will be very vulnerable to a naval presence. It is also not far from the Straits of Hormuz and Malacca, all of which are of great strategic significance. And other than the Philippines, the United States obviously sought a safe haven in the region, and Bangladesh is a country of no significance to it politically and no significance to it on a human level, so they took it. Now, the problem was that Sheikh Hasina declined to cooperate to allow this to happen. I fear this was done in consultation with New Delhi, because the New Delhi did not wish a foreign power on its border, a foreign power which destroyed Mexico in the Americas and subordinated it. So the Indians did not wish this to happen. But an interesting story attaches to this. When Sonia Gandhi was the effective Prime Minister of India after 2004, and I stress the word effective Prime Minister, which was being run by the National Advisory Council headed by her, she ceded Nepal to the United States. India had never allowed any foreign power to poke their nose in Nepal affairs unduly. This was allowed by our alternative Prime Minister, Mrs. Sonia Gandhi. The king was overthrown on the 28th of May, 2008. That is the day on which he abdicated. On the 7th of August, Mrs. Gandhi and her team, including Rahul, went to Beijing on behalf of the United States to reassure them, because the Chinese were not happy with this change in Nepal, because they knew why the United States wants to be in Nepal, and the United States is now everywhere. It has acquired decisive influence in Nepal, far exceeding the influence which India used to have. So Narendra Modi did not agree to surrender Bangladesh to the United States. And between him and Sheikh Hasina, they sought to oppose the United States entering Bangladesh, and therefore the United States used force and used a variety of circumstances, some of them, unfortunately, of Sheikh Hasina's own making and the incompetence of her advisors, to have her removed. And now they're creating conditions on the ground which will prevent any possibility of a reversal of this regime change. Muhammad Yunus, who's 84 years old, is on his way out. He will not survive very long. What the United States and the United Kingdom, by the way, because many of the war criminals of Bangladesh found refuge in the United Kingdom, even today, they have not been extradited. And indeed, in the 70s, a man who worked for the BBC Bangladeshi service and indeed headed it was a war criminal whom the Bangladeshi government wished to have extradited. So both the US and UK are involved, because the UK has substantial assets in Bangladesh. And watch very carefully. Behind the scenes, the Islamic radicals have all been released. For example, the head of the Ansarullah, the chief, Jashimuddin Rahman, has been released immediately on Yunus taking power. This is a signal that the Islamic radicals are the best bet against Sheikh Hasina and any resumption of Indian influence in Bangladesh. One lady called Farida Akhtar is now in the Ministry of Environment. She is someone who proposed that bombs be planted in media outlets to silence them. So inevitably, Bangladesh will only be safe for the United States with radical Islam in the saddle, much like radical Islam under Ziaul Haq was able to facilitate the Taliban in Afghanistan. So Bangladesh is going radical. Does this mean trouble for India? Certainly, this will mean trouble, because they have no love lost, and already there's a huge campaign to boycott Indian goods, and there are many videos showing individuals going from outlet to outlet, examining their display and telling them this is Indian, that is Indian, buy Bangladeshi. They will buy Pakistani, they'll buy Chinese, but they want to secure the new dispensation as completely as possible. And the real threat to this new dispensation originates in India. And they want to make absolutely sure that this does not happen. But there's another side to the story which I will speak on after you've asked me any further question on this matter.
I'm going to play devil's advocate and push back on a few things that you said, Dr. Sen, if I may. Number one, so that there is a full clarity on what we are discussing, right? Number one, let's take the Indian example you mentioned. You mentioned that, in a sense, the India's advisory body during the Manmohan Singh years, which was led by Sonia Gandhi, in a sense, handed over space, vital, strategic space to Nepal. Now, many would argue that Manmohan Singh's government had fairly influential ministers, including, Minister of External Affairs. And it's not just that council, but perhaps the government itself, in some senses, ceded that space. So why would you put it on this body, on the National Advisory Council, and not on the government itself? That's my first pushback.
From all that I know, and I am familiar with some of the key individuals, particularly those who were involved in Nepal, and on many policy matters, the instructions originated with Sonia Gandhi's NAC. They were formally carried out by the incumbent government of Manmohan Singh, but he had no say. In fact, in many cases, the files on government policy went to the NSC first, and decisions were then transmitted. Manmohan Singh had the authority to make decisions on minor matters. And I'll give you an example now. During his tenure, a very good man who was the chairman of the Power Trading Corporation, with whom I had some indirect dealings, was being harassed by a minister because he would not participate in corrupt practices. So he felt that he would be out. A friend of mine was very close to Manmohan Singh. So I wrote a very careful letter to Manmohan Singh, simply saying, nobody should be sacked in your government, given your reputation for integrity, for being honest. I expected Manmohan Singh perhaps to talk to the minister. To my astonishment, this man was given an extension, not of 1 year, not of 2 years, but 5 years. This is the level at which Manmohan Singh had complete autonomy and was able to do the right thing. But on all major decisions, remember, the Manmohan government, under the supervision of Sonia, was prepared to cede Siachen to Pakistan.
We will keep that discussion for another day,
because
because
vetoed by the
Siachen.
Indian Army. That was vetoed by J.J. Singh and the Indian Army, Chief of Staff.
And we will talk about the Siachen issue and in great detail in one of our conversations. But let's stay with Bangladesh for this conversation. I want to talk to you also about this idea that the United States had a hand in the ouster, in a sense, of Sheikh Hasina. The counter to that, Dr. Sen, is how does the US gain? Okay, fine, they get India out of the picture. But if Bangladesh really gets radicalized, in a sense, this radicalization may not help the US, because it will become, because the at the same time the Gulf nations are also transforming rapidly, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on and so forth. Most of the radicals, in a sense, will gather in places like Bangladesh, which if people like the Jamaat and the Hifazat Islam and Anwar Al Ansar and all these groups sort of get into action, this will become a hotbed of Islamic terrorism and militant activity. How would the United States gain by that? Because at the end of the day, it will impact their strategic motivations in the region too. That's number one. Number two, let's say that the US really pushes back against, one of the problems that the US seems to have had, or, one sort of feels reading all the material, the purchase of the submarines that Bangladesh did from China, the starting of the building of BNS Sheikh Hasina, all of these things seem to have, raised the antennae, as it were, of the United States. Now, if they get into action in the Bay of Bengal, now, yes, it sort of cedes space for India, but isn't that also good in a sense for India, because it balances out the Chinese in the Bay of Bengal? To respond to both these two pushbacks.
I will come to the latter question later, because I use the word possibly disadvantageous to India, and I stress the word possibly exactly because of what you've said. We have to wait and see. But I'm afraid I have to disagree with you about Islamic radicalism at the United States. Islamic radicalism has been sponsored by the Anglo-Americans since the 1930s. ISIS was created by the United States, and all the evidence is available from official United States sources. ISIS was created as a vehicle to get rid of Assad in Syria. Taliban, now we know from all the evidence available, again, in the public arena, the Taliban was created by the CIA. So Islamic radicalism actually is totally inconsequential without the US support and part played by the British and the French. Islamic radicalism is entirely a foreign policy tool of the United States. It was used in Chechnya against Russia because Chechnya was the Kuwait of the region with all the major oil pipelines going through Chechnya. Islamic radicalism is being used in India, which is why Islam is being radicalized very sharply in India by political parties. Islam is being used. Now, these forces, without funding from American colonies like Qatar, cannot function. A great deal of funding is now of Qatari origin. It continues to be from private Saudi sources, even if Mohammed bin Salman is no longer anxious to participate. Much of the funding comes from private individuals, very wealthy individuals in UAE, Saudi Arabia, and other countries in the Middle East who are in touch with the United States. Islam is very useful for the United States, and Islam is the way to keep India out of Bangladesh. That is why they're useful, but they will not harass the United States in New York and Washington. They are too far away. The only country they can harass is India. So that is a plus for the United States. Now, whether they will want to or not is another matter, but I do believe they want to see Narendra Modi off. They really find him a very difficult man, and Bangladesh is only one instance that Mr. Modi has refused to surrender India's strategic autonomy and has fought long and hard. And this is not acceptable. And if you look at the way US allies have bowed down completely over the Ukraine, allowed their economies to be destroyed, this is what the United States wants. What Washington says, you do, otherwise you are the enemy. Now, India has resisted US influence, except during those bleak months of 1962 when Nehru begged on bended knees for US help as the Chinese were advancing. Now, Islam is really incidental. The geopolitical issue is the key question, and they want a second area from which to threaten China. They have understood that China is going to be their main rival, and a rather formidable rival, which is making technological progress by leaps and bounds in most fields. They will constitute a challenger, and the United States is simply preparing for the future, and they feel the Indians have something to gain from this, but the Indians don't understand. Because India is not willing to be involved in any conflict between the United States and China. Indian officials have said in private to me, senior officials, that should a war break out over Taiwan, India will be on the sidelines. India may offer refueling facilities, ports, but India will not participate actively. More to the point, India has a very strong interest as it grows stronger to reach an agreement with China. And as India goes stronger, China will have an incentive to settle with India. At the moment, because India is so much weaker, they are attempting to bully India in the hope that India will accommodate. So we are at this very crucial juncture that India is growing very fast, and India is potentially not going to bend to any power. India is a problem. India is going to be a very substantial global power. This is not acceptable to the existing major powers for their own reasons, even though they have problems with each other. India will simply cause greater problems for certainly China and the United States. And the way India has behaved has made many people in Washington very unhappy that India will not play ball. And Bangladesh has been taken away in a sense because Bangladesh was kept neutral by India. And Hasina made some very serious mistakes. Her advisory body was infiltrated by US assets. I won't name the person. I know one person who was certainly a US asset, whom I have known for many, many years, and he was an advisor to her. She also made a very big mistake not refusing to accept the Supreme Court reversal of the quotas. Because six years ago,
And also, it must be, in all honesty, said, Dr. Sen, that I mean, I am thinking of the death of that student, who for the sin of objecting to some negotiation and agreement with India was beaten up and killed by suspected, and suspected, when I say suspected to balance out things, but for all probability, by Awami League sort of cadre, and And this sort of thing, I mean, Hasina was growing more and more authoritarian. I want to ask you a question, and if I may.
Let me just add
Uh,
one thing to this.
yes,
Bangladesh has been a witness to chronic violence since 1971. They've been
yes.
massacring. The entire family of Mujib was massacred by 8 officers. So violence has been the norm in Bangladesh. But what was happening in the past few months was really indiscriminate violence. Though she may not have been in direct control of what was happening, a lot of people were being killed indiscriminately, and this caused a lot of public anger. Second policy mistake. The third policy mistake was misleading economic data. The economy was not in good shape, and a lot of the data was simply being fabricated by the central bank. So all of this has now come to haunt Bangladesh. Look at their reserves. They have only $20 billion reserves, which is enough for 3 months of imports. And they've asked the IMF for 6.5 billion, which is almost a third of their entire reserves. So the economy was not in good shape, contrary to what some jubilant Indians were saying that, look, Bangladesh is doing better than India. They said the same about Sri Lanka once, none of which is true.
Let me also ask you, one of the things that people get puzzled by is, so sure, I mean, far off distant lands and Islamism in distant lands does not impact the US. But in fact, the US has been badly impacted by Islamism. I mean, we cannot forget the history of 9/11 and subsequently, attacks on US bases and others in various parts of the world. It continues to, be a major problem for the US. Uh, how does one balance these two things?
The policymakers and the lobbyists are really not that concerned because it does not impact them directly. It is not as if they are weeping for all the people all the time in their own country. The United Kingdom has suffered huge blows from Islamic terrorism, but it continues to appease them, partly out of fear that it will be even worse if they take them on. But this is a backlash they're prepared to pay the price for. And the United States has paid a much smaller price than, say, Holland, Sweden, now Germany, the United Kingdom, and of course, many other countries, India most of all, the greatest victim of Islamic terror. But they also were unconcerned by the backlash Pakistan's suffered owing to the sponsorship of Islamic terror. So the United States policymaking elite is somewhat remote and unconnected to the cut and thrust of daily life in the United States and the rest of the world. They are looking at strategic goals, and they think we are prepared to pay a price for this. And Bangladesh actually was an easy goal for them to achieve. And it gives them very big dividends in terms of now finding a base from which to threaten China on another front. Now the Chinese are going to be distracted because not only will be the Straits of Taiwan a site for conflict, Myanmar and all the areas, because India will never allow an attack on China from its own territory, which is what the United States is in Nepal. But to get to Nepal, they have to go via India. So it is not entirely satisfactory. They can fly in, but they couldn't fly into Afghanistan without Karachi. So they will need Bombay and Delhi for access to Kathmandu or Lucknow. So that was not entirely satisfactory. They are in Nepal because they want land access to China. And now Bangladesh has given that to them with sea access, so they don't have to depend on India at all. They are opening a number of fronts for grand geopolitical reasons, and we have rather underestimated the determination of this policymaking elite in Washington, and I don't think it will change fundamentally if Donald Trump becomes the president in November.
One of the things that occurred immediately only a few days ago, I think, was from the U.S. Navy's main website, which spoke about the importance of the Bay of Bengal and Bangladesh as a fundamental strategic region of U.S. interest, especially to counter Chinese interests in the Strait of Hormuz, and to deepen, in a sense, China's Malacca dilemma, so to speak, right? And this has just appeared. So, for many people in Bangladesh and in India and many other parts of the world, this sort of underlines the strategic sort of impulses, should I say, on what's going on in Bangladesh. Let me also talk about the other question that I asked you, and you said you'd come to later. Well, is it necessarily? I mean, the US has just signed a major, defense supplies deal with India. which is rare for it to sign such a deal with a non-ally, so to speak. Now, isn't necessarily all bad for India if some of the heavy lifting of countering China in the Bay of Bengal is shared by the US? That's also a question that many ask.
Well, I have been saying all through our interview that the Bay of Bengal is of great strategic importance to the United States. So,
And to us and to India.
and to India. But we will have less of a say now in the future. There are two things which arise from what you say about US supplies to India. The US is not against India at all. They are against any government which does not kowtow with them. They will continue to arm India because India's military strength is a constraint on China. The very fact that India has, I don't know, 400,000 troops in the north ties down the Chinese. That is good for Taiwan. So the United States has never been against India in that sense. They're only against a regime which does not listen to them. I will just add as an aside, and the most difficult person they've dealt with is now Narendra Modi, who talks sweet and then he does his own thing. They really can't accept this. Now, the other thing I should say, US Bay of Bengal will hugely increase the importance of Baluchistan and the BRI for China, because that is an alternative route for their supplies, because the Malacca Straits will be closed within 3 days in the event of a conflict. Submarines will sink any ships going through there. And this will be unavailable. Chinese have already calculated this. So Baluchistan will become very important. Ladakh's importance also goes up. And already analysts are saying they will wage war against India to improve their security on their side of the border by taking a large chunk of Ladakh from India. So Baluchistan is important, which is why India should pay a great deal of attention to the Baluch liberation armies to see what is going on there. But let me say something.
What you say makes sense. I mean, the greater presence of the US in the Bay of Bengal will also mean that China's great idea of building two separate routes. I mean, one, of course, via the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, and the other, of course, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Well, the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, if the Americans really get a hold of Bay of Bengal, that really goes up in flames in some senses, isn't it?
It's the Rakhine region, which is going to be extremely vulnerable.
Yeah.
And the Rohingyas may have a role to play in this. If the Rohingyas are resettled back in the Rakhine region, they will be beholden to the United States or loyal to the United States, which is why the Myanmar military is very vulnerable, because alternative groups settled in that region would be pro-American. Now, there's an interesting side story to this. Bangladesh actually is economically very dependent on India and China. China's trade with Bangladesh is 20 billion, ours is 16, I believe. The problem for Bangladesh is that a huge amount of their electricity power supply is coming from India, Tripura and Jharkhand. A big chunk of that is from the Adani power plant in Jharkhand, and Adani is owed $800 million in unpaid dues. If Adani were to switch off the power supply, and he may be obliged to do that simply because his is not a government undertaking which can be underwritten by tax money. He cannot sustain losses or huge magnitude indefinitely. But the Indian government has also made a very interesting move on this matter, on the Adani power plant. Adani has been told it can import coal, it can sell power to India for the first time. This power plant was designated for exports. The Indian government is now saying you can sell to India so you don't suffer losses. So this is a huge lever in Tripura, which is 120 megawatts, I believe, and the Adani power plant, which is a very major one in Jharkhand, because Bangladesh has difficulty generating power, building dams or building a coal-fired station by importing coal. These are costly long-term projects. In the short to medium term, they have nowhere to go. Now, the United States cannot resolve this problem for them. Bangladeshi apparel production, clothing production is also dependent on Indian cotton exports. And all of these make it very vulnerable. Now, of course, New Delhi has said business as usual because they're playing a wait-and-see game, and they're not going to precipitate any additional conflict. Now, Many are saying that New Delhi has not given up hopes of reversing this coup. I am afraid this is not going to happen. The United States is very invested, and two senior US congressmen landed in Dhaka on Saturday. They are consolidating, and the key card the United States is playing is to provoke ferocious anti-Indian hostility. So this seals a way for completely closes the door to Hasina return. And let's remember, she's 76 years old. The Western media has been mobilized, as always in London, to say that the floods in Bangladesh are indeed the fault of India. And in London, the second language of London after English is Bengali. The second largest language group is Bengali. Urdu is not far behind, though Gujarati and Punjabi are also there. So the United Kingdom, which participated in this coup by using its asset, and it has many people on the ground, broadcasting, BBC, World Service, you name it, they're all saying India deliberately punished Bangladesh by releasing water. Now, this can be easily established as untrue by a technical examination of the conditions under which water was released. And I believe meetings are going to take place because Bangladesh also cannot afford to fall out with India completely, not in the immediate future anyway. So India now has a very delicate problem. Bangladesh is not a military threat to India. They are a terrorist threat, and they will certainly become much more involved in West Bengal with a government which is sympathetic to the Islamists in Bangladesh. But their army is hardly 80,000 strong. So this is not a military threat to India, but what is certainly a threat is cooperation between radical elements on two sides of the border to destabilize Bihar, because West Bengal is already destabilized very comprehensively, and a lot of trouble can be created for India to make India think very carefully about its foreign policy.
Let me ask you another question. You, of course, mentioned how Bangladesh really needs its trade with India and China, and including its vulnerabilities as far as supply of certain resources like energy resources are concerned. I was looking at Bangladesh's, the Bangladesh military's famous Forces Goal 2030 or Forces Plan 2030, which is a forward-looking plan that they had been working with Hasina for a long time. And in fact, Hasina had signed off on many of their plans as part of the, Forces Goal 2030, which involved very rather large chunks of money, perhaps in a sense to appease the army. You pointed out in this conversation that the army, and I wrote in the Sunday Guardian also, the army hangs over like a cloud on Bangladeshi politics. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, of course, you mentioned, assassinated by, army officers, 2011 coup, 2009 uprising, all kinds of things. But the Bangladeshi military, Dr. Sen, substantially gets its armaments from the Chinese these days. They have a lot of stuff coming in from the Chinese. We mentioned the two submarines. We mentioned VNS Sheikh Hasina. There are, all kinds of things. There are, weapons of all kinds. Airborne assets, all kinds of things coming in from the army, from the Chinese, to the Bangladeshi army. Is that an umbilical cord that's easy to cut, no matter how much the US wants it?
You see, the US goal will be to secure the regime it will install. And they may go through the ballot box, as it did in Ukraine, but they want their regime to be stable and secure. And for this, they will have to degrade the Bangladeshi armed forces. The Bangladeshi armed forces, as you just said, constitute a constant threat to civilian government. Now, the US, of course, might choose, as in Pakistan, to put them in power and cut the Chinese umbilical cord. That is also a possibility. My feeling is it'll be a bit of both. Armed forces are sympathetic to a government, so it'll basically be like Pakistan. Army and civilians working together for the United States. Bear in mind, the Chinese are also being pushed out very gently from Pakistan. But the Chinese will not give that up much more very easily. Bangladesh is dependent, but we're talking about relatively small amounts of money. The United States has spent $60 billion in Ukraine. The $20 billion annual trade is not so large that the United States and its allies could not compensate for at least a large part of it. They want Bangladesh as their vassal state, and they have it. And India did not wish Bangladesh to become a vassal of either the United States or China. Basically, the Indians did for Bangladesh what the Russians have been trying to do for India for many decades, to keep them out of Western vassaldom. People say the Russians interfered, but they did not interfere to transform Indian society. They helped India to stay out of the Western camp, which is what the Indian leaders wanted. In the same way, India was trying to help Hasina to stay out of any third party's camp, and they have failed. The odds were very heavily stacked against them, and they failed. So, does it mean immediate trouble for India? I don't think it means immediate trouble for India, because the Bay of Bengal is not something the Indian government is going to try and subvert. They will simply swallow it. But as I say, the radical elements which will be empowered in order to secure a new regime will be in trouble for India. Because they ultimately, in Bangladesh, people don't seem to understand. Language did matter for time. But the most important ideology in Bangladesh is religion. Religion actually is the key factor to explain Bangladeshi politics and society. For a good 70 to 80% of people, religion matters above all. And religion to them is threatened by Kafir India. Their hatred is directed towards India even more than Pakistan, because the Bangladeshis feel more insecure with regard to India. So they have much greater anger and animus. Look at the way they are going house to house. 25 or so Hindu academics, senior academics, principals, directors of institutions have been forced to resign at gunpoint. Forget about all the atrocities, the rapes, burnings, lootings. These are all being allowed to happen in order to give the Islamists a stake in the new Bangladesh in the making, which will be in many ways bad news for India.
No, and as people have pointed out, this interim government has Hifazat-e-Islam as part of it, but it does not have, Awami League, which is Bangladesh's biggest political party. Even though Hasina has left Bangladesh, and there are of course other Awami League leaders, and all of this of course makes it far more complicated. And as you said, Dr. Mohammed Yunus is 84 years old. It remains to be seen how long he will effectively control, and he certainly doesn't control the streets, I think, which is what the sort of subtext of what you're pointing out. He doesn't run the streets at all. It's the Islamists who run the street, if at all. The army has some role. The other thing, of course, Dr. Sen, is that the police in Bangladesh has been significantly weakened after the exit of Sheikh Hasina, because the police were seen to be part of Sheikh Hasina's regime as enablers, and now the police force has really been weakened. So the army is the only real bastion of real strength, apart from the Islamists.
I agree. And the army will play a role unless it is degraded because it doesn't cooperate, but they will cooperate with the new regime at the behest of the United States. But we should not exaggerate the importance of the Awami League. The Awami League cadre is empowered because Hasina is in power. Otherwise, they're a bit like the cadre, even of the CPM in West Bengal, will simply switch sides over time. AAP cadre, they will disappear if Kejriwal disappears. This cadre is basically a paid cadre, which enjoys perks and privileges because the incumbent government finds them useful. So they will evaporate very quickly. Our Awami League actually is far less important than one might imagine. So the Islamists are the only people who are stable and substantial and highly motivated. And they are very useful because they, again, as I keep saying, will secure Bangladesh against Indian influence, any threat of reversal of the regime change which has just occurred. I'm afraid it is somewhat over unless something remarkable happens in the United States, that the United States itself, for other reasons, begins to collapse, which is possible. The economic situation is very difficult, so they may find huge difficulties at home, which will diminish their ability to act abroad. But the Bay of Bengal, as the US Navy is saying, is very important. Remember, it was in the Bay of Bengal that the 7th Fleet appeared to come and threaten India and the Indian Navy, and it was Russian submarines, nuclear submarines, which surfaced to shoo them off and tell them, you better go home.
Yes, and that's history. Remembering that history is very, very important. Dr. Said, as always, I mean, of course, we will be back for many more conversations about this because this will really be one of the most important unfolding situations in the days and months to come for India. Because Bangladesh is set to become one of those, really important global hotspots, marrying many things. Definitely, a deep strain of Islamism and Islamist violence, but of course military overhang, and of course, multiple players in the region. I want to end by one last question. Do you think the Chinese will just give up Bangladesh? Because they have also been trying hard. Now, some people believe that Sheikh Hasina's snub by Xi Jinping right before she exited was a sign of, the Chinese, in a sense, washing off their hands. But others believe that no, the Chinese game also has really begun in all earnest in the Bay of Bengal, and it's a very strategic area for them also. They now see that all the efforts that they've made in Myanmar might come to naught because of what's happening in the Bay of Bengal. Also, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, as all of us know, big question marks on that also because of Balochistan and many other things. So therefore, the Chinese won't give up that easily.
Just to pause for one moment, the great paradox is that India's partition took away two of the most strategically important parts of the world. Pakistan and Bangladesh are extraordinarily important for strategic reasons. And in the case of Pakistan, we have discovered that nobody can let go of Pakistan once they're there because they control the routes into Central Asia, Afghanistan, and also their ports. Bangladesh also, as we now find, is very important, as many people have said in the past. China is not going to give up. And I think their initial response, I anticipate, will be to reinforce their hold in Myanmar. They will attempt to secure the military because they are threatened, particularly the entire Rakhine region, and the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor is something they will try to reinforce, which they're doing in Pakistan despite great difficulties because Pakistan has become a very expensive proposition for anybody to deal with. Bangladesh is also going to be an expensive proposition, relatively poor and a large population. So who is going to fund it all? In a way, you see, the relationship with India was the easiest route for Bangladesh's prosperity because India would carry Bangladesh forward with its own progress. But what China has done in Nepal is an indication of what they will do in Bangladesh. They never quite gave up in Nepal, and they keep coming back. And they've got their man in power right now. And the man the Americans want is waiting to take over in a couple of years' time. So this competition will continue, and the Chinese have enough resources and they have proximity to continue to play a game. Exactly what they do in the future is harder to say, but no, they are not going to give up easily.
And I must conclude then by asking you one last question, which is what should India do? Where does India stand in all of this? I mean, it's a very dire picture that you paint.
Well, there's one thing which is still outstanding, which the Indians have been doing to complete the 700 kilometers of border fencing. Of the 4,100 plus borders, 700 kilometers have remained to be fenced, and it's been delayed because of COVID. And now the Bangladeshis who had agreed with Indira Gandhi they would allow this to happen are resisting. Unfortunately, that border is very porous. It's not easy to seal, very difficult to police. So they will have to spend money on high-tech import from Israel, maybe, to monitor the border. They really need to seal the border much more carefully, and this will be a costly affair, but they will have no choice. But bear in mind, West Bengal, I think, is still before the Supreme Court, resisting the Home Office directive that the BSF should control 50 kilometers as opposed to 15. So securing the border is the first and most important thing. And of course, to deal with the hardline Islamic elements in West Bengal, which is proving much more difficult because they are now very firmly ensconced. They have seized the democratic process and they have cowed the entire opposition, which is not with the TMC. So these are urgent tasks. Seal the border and change the politics of West Bengal. But they have to first deal with the Supreme Court to do that.
Well, tough days for everybody in the region, especially India. We will, as I said, we will be looking at this situation very, very closely as the days and months go by. Dr. Sen, thanks very much once again for your time and reflecting on all these extremely vital issues that are unfolding on India's borders with Bangladesh, going up, in a sense, into a whole new unknown territory and unknown world. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, and sorry for my somewhat jet lag delivery, but thank you again.
Thank you.